Everybody, welcome back to our final panel of the day. We have a distinguished group of people. We're going to talk about where do we go from here. I'm going to introduce the moderator and the panel, and then I'm going to hand it off to John Powell. John Powell is a professor of law and many other things at Berkeley, the director of the Haas Institute for Othering and Belonging. He's my predecessor at the University of Minnesota at the institute I run. He's a great mentor of mine and a longtime friend and co-battler on many civil rights cases, and he's going to moderate our panel. And we have Na'ilah Nasir from the Spencer Foundation, who comes from academia too, but is the head of one of the largest foundations that's interested in education reform, and she's going to be discussing education and equity in the coming years and after the Great Crisis. Mr. Rolley, Otis Rolley, is here from the Rockefeller Foundation, who has an extensive background in addition to philanthropy and managing large city and municipal programs and financing and housing programs and community development. He's also got an expertise on cities and is active there, and he's going to give us his insights about the aftermath of this summer and the coming civil rights challenges. We also have Fred Blackwell from the San Francisco Foundation, who is expert in all the things that we're going to talk about, but particularly housing. Before I hand it over, just to tell all the panelists, we've had a very rich and interesting panel. Our last panel was led by Eric Foner and Barbara Ramsby about the lessons that we could learn from the Reconstruction period after the Civil War and in the great second Reconstruction of the 1960s. They filled us with hope and interesting insights into this. We also had a wonderful discussion with Representative Bobby Smith, the chair of the House Education Committee this morning, who said he'd like to work with us and develop. Hello?
You said Smith, Scott.
I'm sorry, Bobby Scott. I'm sorry, I've had a long day. Bobby Scott, the chairman of the House Education Committee, and he said he'd like to work with us on comprehensive effort to think about how civil rights and labor rights can be re-intertwined. This comes on the challenge we had last year from Representative Clyburn to think big about civil rights and labor and to think about how to pull together the interest groups and activists that have been coming to our conference to try to renew the movement that was so strong in the last period of significant civil rights reform. So with that little update, I'm proud to have you here and welcome you to your panel. I'm going to turn it over to John Powell, who's our moderator.
Good morning in California, afternoon in some places, and maybe evening in some places. So it's great to be here with all of you and be on this panel with my friends and colleagues. Many of you have known for 30, 40 years. So it's been a great conference, and Paul and others ought to be complimented on the conference. I think a lot of people are thinking about, so what do we do now? And I just want to make sure, because I know we're going to have Mr. Trumka speaking. Is he speaking before the panelists or after? So if you can clarify that, then we can proceed.
I think Mr. Trumka was going first.
And this is Mr. Trumka, head of the AFL-CIO. Are
yes,
you on?
Yes, I am.
Yes, the director of the AFL-CIO, the largest and most important labor union in the United States.
And have been at the forefront in many instances of civil rights and trying to make a more just society for close to 100 years. So let me turn it over to Mr. Trumka, and then we'll go back to the panelists.
Good afternoon. And first, thank you to the Workers' Right Institute at Georgetown University Law School, the University of Minnesota Law School's Journal of Law and Inequality, the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity, and Building One America. Now, while I wish we were together, our solidarity, our love, can't be contained in a single room. This week, Representative John Lewis wrote to us from beyond the veil of death. He told us about a voice that he heard on a radio when he was in high school. That voice said, "We are all complicit when we tolerate injustice." Of course, that was the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King. But that's not all John Lewis told us. He challenged us to continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. So we're gathered under the banner of a Jesuit institution, and in those words, I hear echoes of our Jesuit Pope Francis. It's in that spirit of solidarity, of defiance of injustice, and yes, of love of each other and our country that we gather today. In a moment, we'll join several foundation leaders. All of us represent institutions, but our institutions are more than institutions. You see, we're moral visions and legacies, and we've been and must be the foundations, the seed beds of a great movement, a movement for racial and economic justice that's on the verge of sweeping across America. Now, many of you know I first went to work in the coal mines of Western Pennsylvania. I'm a proud member of the United Mine Workers of America. And in 1890, at our founding convention, the United Mine Workers banned discrimination against any member based on race, color, creed, and national origin. See, we never had a Jim Crow local in the mine workers because we learned the hard way that the miners treated us all equally. And by equally, I mean bad. So yes, the United Mine Workers is an institution, but we're also a moral legacy. And so are the institutions represented by leaders here today, like Darren Walker of the Ford Foundation. See, during the Civil Rights Movement, the Ford Foundation supported public defenders, legal aid, and litigation to advance racial justice, just as the steelworkers paid Dr. King's bail, just as the auto workers paid for the microphones that John Lewis and Dr. King spoke into during the March on Washington. And yet our institutions bring complex legacies to the table. The labor movement had segregated locals. We were involved in episodes of racial violence. We must acknowledge our own painful pasts and recognize how the past shapes the present. That's what confronting structural racism required. And we have a moral obligation to get it right, to make Dr. King's dream our future, to live for the causes John Lewis marched for, to win a better day. Because change is coming in America. I can feel it. I see it when I look at the House of Labor, which is now on Black Lives Matter Plaza. I see that change when I look at streets full of young people demanding justice, on picket lines and in voting booths. I see a better day coming. In that better day, no one will live in fear of violence at the hands of those who are sworn to protect them because they are Black or because of their sexual orientation or identity. In that better day, no one will fear being fired because they demand a safe workplace or speak out for justice on the job. In that better day, we won't have to fear that our votes won't be counted or our democracy, the democratic republic, attacked, whether by armed men in the streets or robed judges in the courts. In that better day, the fruits of our labor and the wealth of human invention will not be pocketed by a handful of billionaires, but will be the foundation of better lives for disenfranchised Americans. The future may feel unattainable right now because the pandemic is getting worse by the day. Every day we hear more economic suffering, fed by the politics and economics of immense inequality. And the cancer of structural racism continues to eat away at our country. It's shaping who lives and dies from the virus, who must work and who can stay safe, who has health care and who dies. This moment demands that we decide which side we're on, because together we have a moral obligation to confront these truths. We can't deny this virus has disproportionately sickened and killed Black people. People of color, especially women of color, are more likely to be out of our job. And make no mistake about it, Economic inequality is racially structured. Coronavirus is only the latest tragic reminder of that. The rules are written to benefit those at the top, and those at the top are overwhelmingly white. The Supreme Court favors business over people. It continues to gut voting rights laws, and that entrenches systematic racism deeper into the fabric of our society, and it exacerbates the inequality of power. It feels like we're on a trajectory towards greater inequality of power, greater inequality of income, and greater inequality of opportunity, and that the result will be catastrophic. So we must stop this. We must make structural change. And we've done it before in America. Never perfectly, but we've done it. We fought a civil war, and propelled by the courage and determination of free slaves in uniform, we ended slavery. In the Great Depression, millions of Americans rose up and demanded industrial democracy. For decades in this country after that uprising, economic inequality declined, driven by the economic and political power of the collective bargaining system that men and women, like my parents, literally bled for. And we honor John Lewis because he was a great leader in America's civil rights movement and our moral compass. We went from being a country where John Lewis protested whites-only signs to a country where John Lewis became the conscience of Congress. You see, we're on the verge of a moment when structural change can happen. But our institutions have to be the incubators, the funders, the midwives of change. So when I say we need to confront these crises, I mean we must coordinate our work. We must do as John Lewis asked us and continue to build unity between movements. And let's be honest with ourselves. We haven't really done enough to build that unity. So if we want bold structural change, if we hunger for that better day, we can't keep living in our own little worlds. As large as we think our institutions are, as powerful as we think they are, by ourselves, we can't defeat white supremacy nor bring the structural change needed to reverse inequality. We face the challenge of the coronavirus, of the wreckage structural racism and economic injustice have wrought, of the 2020 election. Let's remind ourselves what Dr. King once said about that which we seek to change. He said, our needs are identical with labor needs. Decent wages, fair working conditions, livable housing, old age security, health and welfare measures, conditions in which families can grow, have education for their children, and respect in their community. That's why Negroes support labor's demands and fight laws which curb labor. That's why the labor hater and the labor baiter is virtually always a twin-headed creature, spewing anti-Negro epithets from one mouth and anti-labor propaganda from the other. 60 years after Dr. King spoke those words, they echo today. In the warehouses, in the nursing homes, in the schools where students and educators are being forced to work in unsafe conditions, in detention centers where our government keeps children in cages, in the numbers that define our economy and our nation's health, the grotesque disparities in wealth and income that shape the lives of all working people, especially working people of color. Dr. King died bringing forth a new day. He died on a union picket line with African-American sanitation workers on strike for the right to collectively bargain. From the moment he was recruited by the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters leader in Montgomery to lead the bus boycott, to the moment he died on the balcony in Memphis, he lived the unity of movements. how can we do less in the face of the towering injustice, the terrifying threats, and the astounding opportunities of our moment in history? How can we not do everything in our power together to bring a new day? The torch lit by Dr. King was carried forward by Congressman Lewis. That torch is now ours to carry on together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trumka. This is Myron Orfield here. I just needed to interrupt for 1 second to say that Darren Walker is not going to be on the panel today. He's expressed his regrets, but he did make a contribution. He says he's making a contribution to help support our efforts after the conference. He had a last minute business. I was a little disconcerted when I began. And I also wanted to especially thank Mr. Trumka for coming today, the head of the largest and most important labor union in the country. And I think we missed telling him that Representative Bobby Scott was interested in working with us on building a strong new Labor and Civil Rights Restoration Act. With that, I'm going to withdraw and leave the panel to John Powell.
Thanks again, Myron. First of all, before we start, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to make maybe a 2 or 3 minute statement just about, I'll make a few friendly remarks myself and then turn it over to you. I know Na'ilah, we're good friends and colleagues. I used to be her boss, then she was my boss, and then she left. Fred and I go way back. So I will be calling them by their first name, but I want to make sure, Mr. Trumka, is it okay to call you Richard or Dick or Mr. Trumka?
Rich. Rich is fine.
All right. And Otis, is it okay to call you?
Oh, this is fine. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Names are important, and I don't want to call anybody out of their name. We've seen a lot of that in the past. As Rich suggested, we have gone through a very long struggle in this country. The labor movement, civil rights movement, women's movement have all been at the heart of it. We're at a point now where we're facing multiple pandemics. Started with, most recently with COVID-19, in the midst of being locked down, literally half the world being locked down. We saw the uprising here in the United States. And now we're seeing the country, in a way unprecedented, focus on not just racism, but anti-Black racism. But we're also seeing a pushback. I live here in the Bay Area. Pastor McBride, Fred will know Pastor McBride, his church, someone tried to set his church on fire recently as he has a Black Lives Matter sign out. We have organizers in the movement who literally don't sleep at the same place for over a week because of death threats. We also have death threats to healthcare workers. So we're seeing all this energy for change, this opportunity for change, but we're also seeing tremendous pushback from the President of the United States suggesting that maybe we have to postpone the election, to calling in federal marshals to storm the streets. So it could go either way. And so some people think it's a violation of their constitutional right to be asked to wear a mask in the middle of a pandemic. And as we look at the data, those people are disproportionately white and disproportionately Trump supporters. At the same time, though, we see a white America, Black America, Latinx America, and Asian, Native American, and people all over the world trying to join hands, trying to say this is different, trying to say this is all of our fight. And we've never seen this level of coalition or intensity in the history of the country. By some accounts, 20 million people have participated in the demonstration. When the Kerner Commission was written in 1968, it chronicled that 170 plus demonstrations had happened in the United States in 67 and 68. We're already over 2,000 in the United States alone. It's much more multiracial. People from labor, people from corporate America, generals and ex-generals in the Army. So something is going on that's really profound. There's a lot of energy to go forward, and yet there's tremendous energy and leadership from the top to go backwards. And so one of the questions I'm going to be coming to you with, and you don't have to address this in your opening remarks, but I do want us to think about how do we actually build something that's lasting, that's more enduring, that actually avoids the backlash of the 1960s, that avoids the backlash of the Reconstruction, that avoids the backlash of the Civil Rights era. We've seen these things look like we're about to go and really build, as President Obama used to say, a more perfect union, as Lincoln suggested, showing our better angels, only to watch us go backwards. And I think many of you already have been doing this work. Funding plays a critical role. Education plays a critical role. So I just want to give you a chance, let's say 2 or 3 minutes, and just opening comments, and then we'll come back to some of these questions. And Otis, if we could start with you.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the opportunity to lend a voice to those comments. And Rich, I really appreciate the comments that you made. My name again is Otis Rolley. I'm from the Rockefeller Foundation, and for more than 100 years, the foundation has worked to really try to advance racial equity in America, because it's core, really very much core to our values. Going back more than a century, our organization has been imperfect, yet consistent as a supporter of the cause. In fact, the Rockefeller tradition of supporting racial equity started even before the foundation opened its doors, with our founder supporting historically Black colleges and universities when they were the only avenue for young African-American women and men to pursue higher education. Spelman College is actually named after John D. Rockefeller's wife, Laura Spelman, and her parents. When modern medicine was in its infancy in the early 20th century, and schools refused to admit Black students, we helped to create medical schools at HBCUs and train generations of African-American doctors and nurses. And when Jim Crow prevented 7 in 10 African-Americans in the South from voting in the 60s, we supported the Southern Regional Council to create groundbreaking voter education project, and which was led at the time by civil rights icon, the late John Lewis. So we helped to register more than 300,000 new voters then. And also when Black mothers who relied on America's social safety net came under attack in the early 1980s, we partnered with community-based organizations to help provide job training, placement, et cetera. So we recognize, and from our very beginning to this day, how important it is to include equity and economic opportunity in our work, and have tried and continue to try. I have the pleasure of leading the Equity and Economic Opportunity Initiative within the foundation. And of the 4 pillars, it is the only one that is focused exclusively in the United States. And part of our emphasis and our work and our focus is trying to create access to capital and credit for BIPOC, for Black, Indigenous people of color, in the efforts that we do both on the policy side as well as our place-based initiatives. Our team has sought to do this work in a way that builds capacity, builds competency, and supports people at the community level. So I'm excited about being part of this conversation and sharing what we are trying to do, both in our successes and our failures, and as we pursue an effort to become a much more anti-racist organization.
Thank you. Before turning to Na'ilah, I want to remind the listeners and watchers that you can send questions. We had to make some adjustments because we think we got Zoom bombed, but still we want to hear your questions, and we'll be collecting them and trying to respond to them. And also, Paul mentioned that we had over 500 people register, and they're from all walks of life, grassroots, grad stops, all over the country. So we're sorry can't be there with you in person, but we're glad to have you virtual, and we're glad for your participation. So Na'ilah.
Great. Good afternoon. It's good to see everyone. I'm honored to be here. I appreciate those comments, Otis and John, your really compelling opening about this moment. And I think I want to dig into that a bit, because I think it's important to hold that progress always has happened in this country in fits and starts, right? Progress isn't linear. And so this moment is both a similar moment to those that we've had in the past where things open, right? Vanessa Seidel-Walker, who's an historian of education, writes about the teachers who were also activists around educational change in the 1940s and 50s. And she argues that when there were openings, they dug into the work. And when it didn't look like progress could be made in certain political moments, they planned for the next opening. And so I think that thinking about the cyclical rhythm of social change work is really important. Having said that, I think this moment is special in a particular kind of way, both because it is particularly dire and because the openings feel broader based. We're seeing that it's really no longer possible to ignore the extreme levels of racial and social inequality in this country. And to the point where we are seeing multiracial, multi-generational coalitions of people taking to the streets. And I think that is something I have not seen in my lifetime. And I think for me, it offers a particular kind of promise. I think we're also seeing a new national language and voice around these really critical issues. I was struck in the wake of the unrest after George Floyd's killing with the number of companies and foundations and schools and district leaders that felt compelled to put out statements underscoring their own commitment. So it feels to me like the work is to translate that emotional commitment into action so that we are really working together to push for social change. And I think it's also interesting that COVID-19 has made all of these issues so much more dire, and we're a lot less distracted than we were prior to that. And I also would just say for me, and I'll dig into this a little bit later in the panel, that education has a really key role in this social change moment in a number of ways. So I'm excited to talk with you and hear what other panelists have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Na'ilah. And now we have a chance to hear from Fred Blackwell. And Fred, as you've worked on these issues for decades, and you're not even that old. But it's been a pleasure working with you around housing and education. You've been a leader both in the organizing world, but also in the funder world. So why don't you share with us how you think about some of these issues now?
Yeah, great to be with everybody this morning, still morning on the West Coast. And John, always good to see you, and you too, Na'ilah. I really want to build on, I think, what everybody else has already said, including you, John. Like you said, I have grown up in a family who has been fighting for racial equity and justice. And so this stuff is stuff that I've seen for a while. We've seen different iterations of it. And I have to say, I have a love-hate relationship to the moment that we are in right now. And, on the hate side of it, like kind of what you mentioned, once again, when COVID struck, what we saw was predictable. Disproportionate impact on communities of color, within that community, disproportionate impact on Black folks. And then we started to see the economic fallout associated with sheltering in place and quarantines and all that. And then again, we bear the brunt of the economic impact, as Rich pointed out in his opening. And so, we started with that, and it was just so frustrating. I'm sure it was as frustrating for others as it was for me to see yet again us coming up on the short end of the stick on the health and economic side of this stuff. Then as we're sitting at home, we see first a white woman in Central Park weaponize law enforcement as a way to threaten a Black man who's a bird watcher. And so your blood starts to boil a little bit more. And then as we're home and we're lamenting that and saying, what's going on? Don't these folks take a break even during a pandemic? We get to watch almost 9 minutes of an officer put his knee on somebody's neck with his hand in his pocket and a smug look on his face. And we all know at that moment it's the same system that produces those disproportionate health and economic impacts, the same system that allows a person in Central Park to weaponize law enforcement on a Black person that allowed him to do that. And I think that for me, just was disgusting. And to see the lack of federal leadership on the one hand to address some of these issues, and then on the other hand, see federal leadership fan the flames of division during that period, I think was just too much for folks. And so that's the hate part. But what I love, and absolutely love, was to see young people in particular take to the street and say enough is enough. And to do that in a multi-generational kind of way, to do that in a multi-racial, multi-ethnic kind of way, and to do it in a way that cuts across other characteristics that are used to divide us, like sexual orientation, sexual preference, sexual identity. All that stuff is kind of coming to the front. We've seen in this moment in some cases, the kind of transformative solidarity that we've always hoped for. And I think that has been wonderful. I also love the fact that we are having different conversations in our institutions and willing to have, and at least for now, sit in the discomfort associated with conversations in this country about race. And so that's another thing that I love. The question, and I think this is the question for the panel and what we'll get into, is whether what is definitely a different moment will be able to be sustained in a way that will lead to the transformative change that we need.
Thank you, Fred. And that's the very next question I want to lead off with and go back to Rich. And again, we've seen something like this. I agree with Na'ilah and others. We never seen anything exactly like this. Someone said it's like 1918 and 1968 meet up in 2020. But in the past, again, we've had these, the Kerner Commission, we had the commission after Rodney King, and some legislation, some movement, but not enough. And then we fall back to earth. And we see sometimes then going backwards. Even after Brown, we saw an opening, and then we saw work in the South, and all of a sudden, all the school segregation reasserted itself. We saw the labor movement play a leading role, and then the labor movement itself grapple with issues in terms of racism and a drop in the labor movement. So, Rich, how do we make this time different? How do we actually not only make this a different moment, but a different outcome? How do we sustain this? You're on mute right now.
I'm sorry. John, I'll answer that question probably in two parts. One about the AFL-CIO and the labor movement, what we're trying to do to make sure this isn't a passing moment, but the rise of an opportunity. And then the second thing is when you look at it in a bigger sense, there are actually two components when you're out there. There's a movement, and if you're all movement, the movements come and the movements subside. And then you have institutions that are there forever, but sometimes they ossify. They get ossified and they don't move at all. The trick, I think, is to have enough movement and enough institution that it's sustainable. And we're looking to build those partnerships so that we can provide education, mobilization, resources, but without being sort of an anchor around the neck of a movement. We want to grow the movement, but we want to have enough institution so we can sustain the movement going forward. And to do that, we're reaching out to partners to build real partnership in this fight to end racism. Our goal is to be the tip of the spear when fighting racism. The labor movement has to be at the very tip of the spear, not down in the middle of the shank, but at the tip of the spear, and that's where we're going to be. So I just started a race commission on racial, or a task force on racial justice, and it will do several things. First, it'll look at us internally and see what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. And, we represent police and we represent everybody else. And so we're going to have those conversations. We're going to be a transformational agent, a change agent, so that we can change the culture of police, and then engage with communities to try to find out what public safety means to them. Not us try to define it, but go to the community and say, what does public safety have to mean to you, so that we can then try to provide that level of community safety for everyone. Everyone, no matter what you look like, no matter who you love or who you worship. And so we're doing that. The second part is we're looking at all of our institutions, all of our affiliate organizations, all of our affiliates, all of our constituency groups, to make sure that we're doing what's right there and having the right conversations. And then again, the third part is we're reaching out to the community itself. And so when I said in my opening speech that institutions, all of us have sort of been too self-centered, I really mean that. All of us have been doing good work, but that good work hasn't changed things. We're only going to make change when all of us come together to do that good work. And we sort of have a common image and a common demand, and we're willing to make the sacrifices, to provide the resources, and to step back sometime, to say, I don't have to be the leader in this one. Somebody else can be the leader. I want to be the follower because I want to help get to the goal. And the goal is to end racism so that every person, regardless of what they look like, who they worship, who they love, where they come from, has a fair and equal opportunity in this country, and is not denied that opportunity for any illegitimate reason.
So, Rich, time is sort of slipping by really fast, and I want to get the other panelists in, but I want to just stick with you for one more minute. A lot of the work we do at the Institute, Othering and Belonging Institute, is about bringing people together who might otherwise seem very different. So you mentioned the police. Sometimes when we talk about race in this country, white people feel like they're being left out, and sometimes they are being left out. So how do we actually build something? And I know you work with my colleague and friend, Ian Haney Lopez, and he says it's not race or class, it's race class. We have to hold on to both of those things at the same time. But how are you working on that in the labor movement to make it real so that people realize this is for everybody, it's not just for one group, even though we may take it through the lens of racism and anti-Black racism?
We're actually dividing all the groups up and saying there's racism in every one of us. There's racism among whites, there's racism among Blacks, there's racism among browns. Let's talk about it. Let's have that conversation. It's going to be a tough conversation. John, it'll be the second time that we had it. Right after Ferguson, I went across the country and we were having conversations about race during that period of time. And I never forget, we were in Birmingham, Alabama. And when we went in, we had white members and we had members of color in there. And it looked like a high school or 8th grade dance. You know, all the white people were on one side, all the people of color were on the other. And I made everybody come together. And for the first hour, nobody wanted to talk. Everybody was afraid to talk because they were afraid that if they'd say something wrong, they'd get attacked. But then all of a sudden, this trust started to develop among that group. They actually started opening up their hearts and talking to one another. That's where we want to get to. We want to have a conversation where we open up our hearts and we talk. And I can say something to you without you making me feel illegitimate or you attacking me, so that then we can reconcile the feelings. Because most of the time, what we found was it's based on misconceptions and misperceptions about people and about things. And when you brush past that, they really do realize that there are so many more things that connect us together than the few things that divide us apart. And we're trying to instill that from top to bottom with the leadership and with our rank and file, and then with the community to have that conversation. The conversation with the police unions is the same way. You come in, and if all you do is attack the police union and say you're all bad, you really aren't. They really aren't all bad. You know, our unions, our police forces are made up of people of black, brown, yellow, red, every other thing. They're gay, they're straight, they're men, they're women. They do everything, and bringing them together to say, how do we change? Because there are bad elements there. There are bad elements. Most of you are good people, but there are bad elements. And how do we empower you to help us eliminate those bad elements? How do we empower you to communicate with the community to find out what it is the community needs? Not what we think they need, but what do they need? And so it's going to be hard work. And I can tell you this, we're committed for the long term. And when the COVID comes and goes, the spotlight is not going to go off of this as far as we're concerned, because we have institutionalized this in the AFL-CIO and in our union movement.
Thank you. So Otis, let me turn to you. So you mentioned that, and I'm well aware of Rockefeller's history in terms of helping with voting. James Baldwin said, not everything we face can we change, but nothing will change unless we face it. And so even as we sort of face race, doesn't mean it's going to change. And President Obama, in his eulogy to Congressman Lewis, noted that there are all these structures in place to make it harder for us to vote. And one of the things I wanted to lay on the table is we just had the potential re-enfranchisement of the largest number of voters since 1920, 1.4 million returning citizens of all stripes, all races. Actually, the majority of them are white, but a disproportionate number are Black and brown. And they got 65% of the votes in Florida to change the Constitution to restore their voting rights. And as you know, the Republican legislature and the governor then said, you can't vote until you pay off all of your fines. So we still have a new poll tax. And one question I want to put out there, and Obama mentioned this the other day, and Michael Jordan, who historically have been shy about being public in these things, just said he's given $1 million to this effort. The figure that the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition is using is they need $100 million. So I just want to put that out there, but also what can funders do, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of leadership, also in terms of being a moral compass for our society, especially when we don't have the leadership from the White House?
Well, I think first and foremost, as funders, it is with our money. And so it is really making the determination to fund those types of things that are going to cause system change. I think when I look at what we're doing at the Rockefeller Foundation, part of it is not just past funding, but current funding that we're doing around voter education and voter empowerment that I'm excited about, and that I think will go towards the efforts that you're communicating about. But I also think it is, and I want to talk a little bit about what was mentioned earlier about not just seizing the moment, but how are we involved in this work for the long haul? So yes, we're putting our dollars towards voter education and voter outreach now, and in this moment. We've done it in the past, which is very important. But we're also doing certain things as it relates to the Rockefeller Foundation, which has been in existence for over 107 years, to invest in those types of things that are going to help us to also be an anti-racist foundation. So when you think about what we've done, both good and bad, acknowledging both the good and bad, you also have to think about how do you make sure that while this door is open, while this window of opportunity is open, and people are accepting for a brief moment the willingness to look in the mirror, to address that man or woman in the mirror, how do you take advantage of that? And so one of the things that we're doing is over the next 12 months, we're going to be engaging in some deep work at the foundation, because it'll be great for us. We give away around $250, $275 million annually. And that's wonderful, right? And so we could take a portion and say, oh, well, 10 million, 50 million of it, 100 million of it is going to be allocated towards racial justice, which would be great. But I think what would be greater is for us to change as an organization and come out of it in a way so that all 275 million are now being allocated in a way that is anti-racist, that is respective of and embraces diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I'm excited Our president is going to be talking about this soon, but this is some of the work that we are intended to do internally, securing that mask, as when back in the day when we used to get on these things called airplanes, but securing that mask first so that you can spread that oxygen to others. I think we also need to do that internal work to be anti-racist at the Rockefeller Foundation, so that our grant making, our partnerships, our perception of power can change and develop, not just in this moment, but for the long haul.
Thank you. Thank you. Na'ilah, so education is at the center of this, and right now we're facing a big educational fight that would actually involve you and the unions, or should I say educators in the unions, as states are trying to open up without the right protection. The communities that will be hardest hit will be kids of color being forced to go back to school where we still have the virus without protection. Teachers are saying, some of them are quitting, are resigning. They said there was something like 1,300% increase in teachers requesting wills because some of them expect to die. And obviously you can't really we already had a deeply broken educational system. Detroit just got sued, and they won the suit saying kids were coming out of school illiterate. Detroit's a city where 80% of the students are Black. So how do you think about these issues? What can we do to sort of change this? We've been fighting this battle around education for a long time, and you're one of the great educators in the country. So what can we do about this?
Well, yeah, we've been fighting this battle halfway for a long time, and I think that what's interesting for me right now is everybody's home with their kids. And so there's this new appreciation for public schooling as an institution, for teachers and their levels of expertise and patience. And so it could, if galvanized, right, become a really important and kind of lightning rod moment to get to gather support for public education. That means a lot of things, right? That means, one, we've been defunding education for years and years. We fund education at lower levels than any other industrialized country, at any other industrialized country. And when you combine that with these high levels of racial and social inequality, situation where teachers in most major cities cannot afford to live. And so there are some major things to do around the funding of education, thinking about teacher salaries and building a teacher pipeline that's going to be qualified to teach the teachers, to teach the children of the next generation. And I think we're a bit of the way there around public support for public education, but much more ground needs to be covered there. We also, I think, are seeing, like in many other institutions and sectors, the deep, deep structural inequalities and the implications of those. Well, the way that I think that's played out in the public discourse has been around devices and access to broadband, but it goes much deeper in terms of access to qualified teachers, access to counselors, the way that the pipelines move from elementary schools to middle schools to high schools to college, that at every point in that pipeline, there's vast differences in the level of resources, which comes down to a couple of things. It comes down to how schools are funded and the mechanisms by which we fund schools. And it comes down to the high levels of segregation in our society and the way that affords this unequal provision of educational access. But there's something else too around education that I think is showing itself and is really, really important for us to not forget about. And that's the content. What is being taught, right? Because we've been in this to kind of back to basics, heavy testing around basic subjects, not doing social studies because you're doing reading and math because you want the kids to pass the test. And I think to some degree we are seeing the fruits of that strategy, which is that you have citizens that don't really understand how to be engaged, don't have the historical knowledge, don't have the knowledge of how governmental institutions run, the importance of voting, the respect for science and evidence. And so there's a bigger piece around content. Essentially, schools were structured for an industrialized age to create workers. And I think another kind of upside in this moment is as schools recede from the center in some ways, and families and communities are also engaged in the education of young people, I think we will see a move towards what is the learning and what's the content that people really need to fully realize their potential, to fully engage as citizens. And so I think it's a really critical moment for education on a number of levels. And I did want to say something about, you were asking kind of what's necessary in this moment. And I was thinking that one of the really interesting things that is starting to emerge that we have to figure out how to leverage is coalitions and collaborations across sectors, across institutions, across types of organizations, where I think we're seeing in philanthropy new kinds of partnerships with grassroots organizations, with community change organizations. And that I think is going to be really key in having solutions that we can all wrap our arms and funding around to move in a direction together. So I'll end there and leave space for others.
So we're getting close to the end. I want to invite the listeners to send questions. I haven't seen any, and I know it's a wonky way to do it because we're not going to have the chat function happening. But I want to encourage you. Before we turn to Fred, there's one more question, Na'ilah. You spoke about content. I don't know if you've seen the latest data, but they said more than 50% of the millennials, or young people, millennials and generation, what is it, Z now, up or down the alphabet, more than 50% said they don't know how, they don't feel equipped, they're not educated in terms of using mail-in voting. More than 50, and millennials are the largest single group in the country right now. I just found that staggering. It's like, first of all, I don't think of mail-in voting necessarily as being all that difficult, although I know some people in this country would like to make it extremely difficult, starting with closing the post office. Any thoughts about that? How do we we only have a few months before this really pivotal election. How do we make sure the people have the education and the resources to actually vote?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to utilize the tools that we have, right? Social media and the digital footprint is an amazing tool for spreading information quickly and effectively. So I think I'm sure folks are working on this, but targeted campaigns around mail-in voting feel really essential. And then, the bigger, more long-term work around civic engagement and the importance of voting and sharing with young people that you said to me once, John, and I have never forgotten it. I think I was complaining about the younger generation, and you said, wow, yeah, who's raising these people? And so I think there's something really important also about reflecting on what does that trend mean for the experience and knowledge we've provided for this generation, and how we have alienated them around hope. And I think that there's a lot to talk about there, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Fred, coming to you, you're in a particularly unique position, Fred, in the sense that you're a community foundation. So you work with a lot of donor advised funds. You're in the middle of the tech center of the world. I've been, for the last couple of months, meeting with heads of tech. They're all saying they want to do something, they want to do more. And some of them actually have done more than they've done in the past, both not just putting up the sign Black Lives Matter, but making commitments, money and otherwise. How do you think about organizing this community as well as the grassroots community? And then also, if you could speak to the relationship between how do we break the back of housing segregation that actually fuels education segregation. And we see the Trump administration is going backwards on that. They're trying to really use the fear of housing immigration to whip up racism in the suburbs.
All right. So you got about an hour, John?
Brad, I do all day, but I don't miss time.
I'll try to tackle those, but I do want to also kind of jump on the other question like Na'ilah did and Rich did and Otis too, about kind of how we move from moment to transformative change. And there are 4 things that I would submit, and I think they are applicable to the other questions that you asked. I think that this is a moment, and I love all the announcements that are coming out around, as others said, kind of the support for Black lives, the statements that are coming from corporations, and the support for, in particular, organizations that are led by Black people and people of color. And I think that that's really important. But we also have to support Black power building and movement building as well. And I think that that's distinct from supporting Black-led organizations. It's an addition to. I think the second point, though, is that we can't let that kind of centering, as you suggested, of anti-Black racism, and I would also submit anti-Indigenous, turn into a conversation about the oppression Olympics, or a place where we are thinking that one community's gain has to be another community's setback. And as you know, I grew up in Oakland, which means that I'm kind of really a child of watching the Black Panther Party and Black Power in that context. And I think that there are some important lessons there around how you can center building Black power, but do that, which brings me to my second point, in a way that is inclusive and intersectional, so that people understand, particularly non-Black people of color and poor whites, understand that much of what they're experiencing is impacted by and a result of this country's original sin around slavery and the looting of indigenous land. And that it's not either or, my problem is worse than your problem, but they're connected. And I think that that's very important. Third is, I think that philanthropy has to enter into a different relationship with those who are building Black power and supporting movements this time around. Our proximity to the money and therefore the power does not mean that we need to sit at the head of the table, nor does it mean that we need to be softening or undermining the boldness of the agendas that have been developed for years and sometimes decades. And then the other thing is, I think we have to interrogate this concept around allyship. And what I mean by that is, I appreciate allyship, but there's a part of it that suggests that you're helping me with my problem. And racism in America and anti-Black racism in America is all of our problems. And we need the language that takes that into account. Taking all that, I think thinking about donor advised funds and how we organize those with wealth around these issues, I think that we need them to be holding these kinds of four principles that I talked about. The need to support power building, the need to do it in an intersectional way, the need to be in a different relationship, and the need to interrogate allyship. And so I think that that forces us to be in a different kind of conversation with wealth and with the corporate sector. And we got to get beyond the statements and even the financial support that is being put on the table. Corporations, if they're serious, need to be looking, their boardrooms need to be looking different, their C-suites need to be looking different, the diversity of their staff need to be looking different, and the support for those diverse staff needs to be looking different and be more aggressive as well. Folks shouldn't have to check who they are and put their emotions around the current moment aside to show up to work. That needs to be an important part of being whole. So I think that that's important. And the last thing around housing, I can't describe to you how disgusting it is for me to see the rolling back of affirmatively furthering fair housing and the tweets that aren't even dog whistled anymore, coming from the president saying that we're protecting your suburbs by not allowing fair housing. We have got to do better than this. We've got to hold folks accountable to something different. And it's not just a federal problem, it's a local problem. As you know, John, we use local land use and zoning to exclude poor people and people of color from communities that are the very communities that have access to opportunity on a daily basis. Sometimes we do it overtly. A lot of times we're doing it in a dog whistle kind of way. but it's not just a federal problem. It's a very localized problem. And all you have to do is go to a planning commission meeting or a city council meeting in your community, and you will see it almost every day when somebody's looking for an approval for a project that suggests that Black people, brown people, people of color, or poor people might be living in those buildings.
So thank all of you. We have about 8 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you one last question and give you a chance to make closing comments. And I'm going to try to pick up some of the questions that are being forwarded to me through the chat room. And one I want to start with, Rich, maybe with you, or maybe actually let's reverse it. Let's come back to Rich, because we are aware, Rich, you talked about the need to address racism in the labor movement. What we haven't talked about as much is how much anti-union and anti-worker sentiment is built into our society. Maybe, Fred, I'll start with you, because again, I've been working with tech companies here in the Bay Area, and they've been doing some interesting work, and for them, maybe even great work. But we all know that many of them are vehemently anti-union. And so they do stuff in terms of power building. The union has been the most effective way for workers to build power. So how do we actually, and then the also tie-in question is, what concrete can we do to sort of build this bridge and make this moment into a long-term transitional change? So those two questions for you, Fred. The anti-union movement that's baked into many of the people with high wealth, even when they're liberal, and how do we build something concrete going forward?
Yeah, you have struck a nerve with me, John, about the Bay Area, which is, you know, we like to consider ourselves like a dark blue region in a blue state, and associate ourselves with progressive thought and liberalism. But when it comes to issues having to do with people of color, when it comes to issues having to do with class and poverty, we are consistently producing poor outcomes and not living up to who we like to think we are. I always talk about the fact that in the Bay Area, what we are up against is the fact that our perception of ourselves is out of line with reality. And this point that you make around unions is a very important part of that piece. And so I think part of, again, being intersectional, understanding that some of these issues that we're trying to deal with, John, are rooted in race and racism, but some of them are also rooted in poverty and classism is an important part of the analysis. And there's instances where they are unique and distinct in nature, but most of the time they travel together. And the key to building bridges, I think, across these two areas is understanding that they do travel together, and what people are experiencing economically has to do a lot to do with race, and what people are experiencing from race has to do with an analysis around labor. And so I think that that's really important, and I think it's important for us to continue to keep that on the table. The other thing, though, and I'm glad Rich talked about this, is that part of what is required is for labor sometimes to understand its contribution to the injustices around race, particularly in the Bay Area around this stuff. I mean, there are many places where you can go to Black and brown communities, and they have felt historically excluded from the opportunity associated with being a part of the labor union, especially on the building trade side from time to time. And so there's a need for all of us to, again, be comfortable with the uncomfortable conversations that we need to have in order to get to transformative solidarity.
Thank you. So Otis, I'm gonna come to you, and then Rich and Na'ilah, you're gonna do that and clean up. And we only have 3 minutes left. So what concrete can we do moving forward? And what's the role of the foundations writ large, not just Rockefeller, but what concrete can we do in this moment is crying for something different, crying for transformation. Again, President Obama listed out several things. Let's get rid of the filibuster. Let's have a true Voting Rights Act. Let's let's honor John Lewis. So what can we do both long term, but we do have a very important 3 months ahead of us as well.
So three things, and I'll try to be as quick as possible. One is, I think it's around funding, and the funding going towards Black-led organizations and community-based organizations that are serving Black and Brown populations. So I think all foundations can and should be doing that, because that's also a shift. If you look, whether it's Rockefeller or any organization, any foundation, it's an interesting mix. And I think if we are serious about this anti-racist work and trying to reverse what has been done historically, our dollars need to reflect that. I think second is really around changing in our grant agreements, in terms of changing the relationship between the grantee and the funder. And I was once told that, that really there's two functions in life: to teach and to learn. And if we approach our grant making with that perspective, that there is something that we can teach, there's something we can learn, and that there's and our funder and our grantees have that same attitude, and we develop and put that into the grant agreement, so that we're not just looking for the impact statement or the KPIs related to the impact, but also where is the give and take, so that there's true partnerships. Foundations are always talking about these are our partners, our grantees are our partners, but the real deal is that often is not the case. There was a power dynamic where we're writing the check, you will do as we kind of tell you to do, kind of foolishness. And we need to change that if we're serious about long-term change. And then third is the walk and the journey that I talked about that we are beginning to go on at the Rockefeller Foundation, that I would really advocate, not just for other foundations, but I would say for the AFL-CIO, for corporations, for everyone, to actually start to do that deep work. It's not one training. I remember the foolishness that occurred when all of a sudden we realized, oh, we're going to do the sexual harassment training. And there was one training, and then all of a sudden people were faking as if they changed the behavior. They didn't change the behavior. They still were not treating women as if they were equals, right? But there was a law, there was a rule, so they had to do this one training, and then they moved on. I would say that if we're serious about this work, go on that long journey. Not just one training, but commit to at least do it for a year. So internally, we're doing that ongoing training, but then we're also auditing all our policies, our procedures, our grant making, our investments, our procurement. If you're serious about this work, those three things I would say that you need to do. And that last one is probably the most important. And it can't just be foundations that do that, but corporations, labor unions, churches, all of us, we need to do that work and not just put up a Black Lives Matter sign.
Thank you. Rich? You're muted.
For years, we've been told that we can't change the economic outcomes because it's the market. The market decides all this stuff. Well, the market's nothing but a set of rules. Those rules are made by the men and women that we elect, and those rules decide the winners and the losers. So the first thing we can do is actually start looking at the women and men that we elect and make them commit to changing the rules, to ending racism, to having a better economic system that gives everybody a chance. That's the first thing you can do. Second thing I think we can do is a deep self-evaluation, where we look at ourselves and we continually try to get better. And we honestly look at what we're doing wrong and don't run away from it. Don't look like it's a weakness to say I did something wrong. Look at it as a great strength. The third thing is the rules that govern the workers in this country. Right now were made in 1947, and they cut down the power of working people. And then in 1959, they increased that cut down of power. There was another act that took away more power from workers. So right now there's a great imbalance between workers and employers that needs to be rebalanced. The best way to do that is to pass the PRO Act. It's an act that is in front of Congress right now. It has passed the House of Representatives. It is sitting in the graveyard of the Senate with Mitch McConnell. We will get it passed. It will change the rules, and it will allow working people to get a better share of the wealth that they produce. And remember, union women don't get 78% of what union men do. They get the same exact thing. Blacks, whites, browns, reds, everybody gets paid the same rate under a union contract. And those instances where people were froze out, you talked about the trades, Fred. The trades are really working hard to change that. And we're going back and doing remedial training so that those people, our friends, our brothers and sisters in the community that couldn't pass an entrance test, will be able to pass an entrance test and get into our programs, our apprenticeships, and have a real career and a real future. We're working very, very hard at that.
So Na'ilah, we're at time. We want to give you a chance to make a brief comment, and then I'll close. So, and I'm going to tackle on something Fred talked about building power. And it's clear to me that one of the ways you build power is through coalitions, is through bridging. And I worry a little bit that even as we sort of appropriately focus on communities of color, that we don't leave out poor whites, that we actually make this a larger movement, and that it really is, as Fred suggested, racism is about America. It's not just about Black America, it's about all America. So anyway, so if you could comment on that in your closing comments.
Yeah, I would just quickly say that, to my mind, I think what we all have to understand is that racial inequality and social inequality harms all of us, even the people who purport to be at the top. Because if our systems are weak, we are not developing the infrastructure, the informed citizenry, the workers of the future, the innovators of the future. All of that is suffering. And so I think this is very much, as folks have commented, about changing mindsets and also about changing systems.
Thank you. Well, it's been a delight to be this hour and 15 minutes went by really fast. It speaks to the great minds and the great people on this call. So again, I want to turn it back to Myron and Paul. We talked a little bit, Fred, about the affirmatively furthering fair housing. And I think Myron and I had a substantial hand in getting that rule passed in the first place. So we're particularly sorry to see it's being attacked so viciously by the Trump administration. So Myron, I will turn it back to you.
Yes, I thank you very much, John, for a wonderful panel. Is Derrick Johnson ready? Is he here on the?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. All right, it's my honor to introduce you. I just want to make sure you're here before I introduce you. Well, it's a great honor to have Derrick Johnson, the president and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. He's been at every one of our conferences, and we've been proud to have him. He's given some of the most fabulous speeches that we've had at our conferences that have inspired people to action. We've had a fabulous conference here. We've had a congressmen, we've had philanthropic leaders, we've had labor leaders. Rich Trumka's here, the head of the largest and most important labor union in the United States. And people are seeking to rebuild the alliance between civil rights organizations and labor. And we talked to Representative Bobby Scott this morning, and he said that he would work with us on working for a substantial civil rights restoration act that would strengthen civil rights and labor rights together, combine things like the PRO Act and efforts to overturn Shelby County versus Holder and increase the ability to have integrated schools in the country and support President Obama's fair housing initiative. So we have quite a good challenge from some important people. Representative Clyburn, as you know, gave us the challenge the last time we were here together. And so we're wondering if you think that labor and civil rights can work together, whether it would be important to work with Representative Scott and Representative Clyburn and other people in the Congress and other people to advance policies to deal with the structures. Is it time to think about a Civil Rights Restoration Act and an ability to think about how we make this country and renew this country's effort to support equality and justice, both in the labor sector and in the civil rights sector? They're really one and the same. So we're honored that you're here. We thank you for all of your leadership in a terribly tough time. We want to seek your counsel and your advice about how we can work to support you and support the efforts of the labor movement and others, and think about policy issues that we can champion together. We want to work together with you and others to create a better and more just America. So thank you for coming, President Johnson. We're honored by your presence. We've always been honored by your presence. And I give you the floor.
Thank you, Myron. Thank you, Gary, for once again putting on this conference. I hate I missed the last panel, because anytime John Powell is doing something, it kind of quiets the room in awe, because it's always such a good presentation. We are in a unique juncture where in my lifetime I have never seen before. What I'm looking at is this new reality of how we move from protests in the streets to power at the ballot box to public policy change. And I say that because in this moment, you look across the country over the last 4 weeks, you see peaceful protests, and the individuals who make up the crowd truly look like America. You have Black and you have white, you have young, old, male, female, varying backgrounds, all chanting the same chant, the factual statement that Black lives matter. And it's an important statement. It's a statement of fact. It's not simple. It's not a simple hashtag. It's not an organization alone. It is a statement of fact, a fact that this nation has not truly come to grip with, that our lives matter, that Black lives matter. And the coming to terms with that statement of fact must be born out of public policy changes that are so necessary. But it's a juncture where people are in the streets raising their voices, and corporate America finally acknowledged that structural and systemic racism exists during the time that allow us to truly take this moment and move forward if we continue the momentum, or take this moment as a flash in time and go back to business as usual. It is the work of the NAACP, and I'm sure many of you on this Zoom, to work in a way in which we can move people from protests to power at the ballot box, and from power at the ballot box to public policy change to address systemic and structural racism that has plagued this nation for decades, and in fact, centuries. For the NAACP, I have committed myself since 1990 to use this organization as my vehicle for voice. And as we all make the choice of how we want to amplify our voice, whether we use it as individuals or whether we use it through organizational existing organizations, we all have a challenge to make sure we move into the future. And with that said, it's not going to be easy between now and November. It's not going to be easy on election day in November to make sure the will of the people is truly heard, because we have a looming presence in the White House who simply may not accept the outcome. But we must prepare for the opportunity of making this nation what the founding fathers proclaimed it to be, to make this nation a more perfect union, to make this nation something that many thought would never happen. But it is our job to make what people think is impossible possible. That cannot be done if we allow the existing structures and systems to continue to perpetuate the level of structural neglect for African Americans, and for that matter, all communities. You know, as you framed out, Myron, the concept of how labor and civil rights work together, for African Americans, civil rights is about labor, and labor is about civil rights. You understand the journey we've had in this country, our ability to collectively bargain or to individually bargain for our labor is at the center of the struggle for human dignity for African Americans. We were brought here to be exploited for free labor. We picked up arms and reinforced the Union Army to defeat a treasonous Confederate army so that we can have the ability to not be exploited for our labor. We began to make progress only to be halted during a period called redemption, because there were those who sought to put us back into a position of exploitation for our labor, albeit cheap, but it was still exploitation. Much of the fights that we have carried on have stood on a three-legged stool with many derivatives that come out of that. One, our ability to be fully recognized as a citizen and fully participate with our franchise so we can impact the formation of public policy to meet the needs and interests of our communities. 2, to ensure that our young people can have access to quality education equal to anyone else in this country so that they can build a society that best reflects who we are. And the age-old debate between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, our ability to become critical thinkers and add to society. And then thirdly, that we can eke out a living from our labor. There is no separation between the two from the eyes of African Americans who understand this historic trajectory of how we got here, the journey it has taken us to be in this moment, and the fight that has been ongoing. Moving from protest to power should allow us the ability to leverage our collective currency called the vote so that we can put in office individuals who reflect the needs and interests of our communities. So the value proposition of that factual statement that Black Lives Matter can be carried forward when those policymakers who are so elected begin to deliberate around public policy that's different than what we look at right now. I was on a news station recently and the question came up, well, what is structural racism? What do you mean by that? What is systemic racism? What do you mean by that? And I gave a few examples. And one of the examples I always like to share is that most of you on here, because you're experts, know the story of how one of the most profound pieces of legislation was adopted into public policy to create the Social Security program. But Southern legislators decided that they wanted an exemption in the law in order to get their vote. And that exemption was to not qualify individuals who were domestic or agricultural workers. And during the time this was a part of the conversation and ultimately the legislation that was adopted, 80% of African Americans worked in the areas of domestic or agricultural labor. Therefore, locking us out for a couple of generations from being able to benefit from that most profound social safety net, therefore creating an additional burden on families financially that we are still working to get from under. On top of that, the number one wealth driver in this country was through the FHA loan program, allowing people to qualify for home mortgages at rates that we had not seen, growing a middle class that many people had not realized was possible up until that point. And in that legislation, it allowed for local bankers and developers to determine who would qualify for home mortgages and who wouldn't, locking us out from the ability to acquire wealth and build the communities that would be sustaining over time. And when you overlay that with the resistance to comply with that Supreme Court order we call Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and the mandate to move at all deliberate speed, deliberate slow, speed fast, and what do you get when you put those two words together? You get a mess. And that is what has happened with our education system, because it took all the way up through the 1970s before districts were being forced by courts across the country to finally comply with the Supreme Court mandate. But about the time they began to comply, we began to see suburban communities using FHA loans get established with restrictive covenants so Blacks could not move in if they had the resources, or they were locked out from qualifying for mortgages if they wanted to move in, thus creating enclaves and separate school districts, levying funded by property tax that were elevated, while the communities that we were forced to live in, the value of the homes were cut. The taxation that was levied against those properties to fund the schools was undermined, and the quality of education that was delivered was based on one zip code, creating a structure that we are still addressing today. I'm a native of Detroit, Michigan, and there's a street called Tireman. And if you cross the street, you go from the city of Detroit to Dearborn, Michigan. If you cross the street, even today, the cost of home insurance, the cost of car insurance doubled by just crossing the street from Dearborn to Detroit. A level of redlining that has created a predatory scheme that have locked many African Americans out of enjoying in the prosperity of this nation. Moving from protest to power at the ballot box to public policy should be the number one thing we all begin to focus on. How do we reverse all of these injuries that have been imposed upon the African American community? But most importantly, if we address it for African American, we can address it for society as a whole. That it is great to protest in the street, but if it's not based on public policy change that can be enforced, it is noise in the street and a lot of energy that should have been used elsewhere. It is great to turn out to vote in high numbers, and we must do that now, not only for the federal elections, but for state and local elections. And Lord knows we need more accountable district attorneys across the country to hold law enforcement agencies who decide to aggressively police in some communities and protect and serve other communities, that standard that can no longer be tolerated by anyone in society. Moving from protest to power to public policy would allow us to live up to the true creed that was embedded in our Constitution, that all men and women were created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. Here is our opportunity. It is important for this convening and all of the experts that participate, ensure that we have the policy chops. So when those policymakers take office, those policymakers being individuals who were elected because of the values of that factual statement that's in the street today, will go to the polls and actually put in place individuals who will be accountable to a value proposition, that equal protection under the law should be afforded to everyone, that discrimination should not be tolerated, that access to opportunity should be unfeathered, that the health of this society should be based on how well we treat our elders, whether it's the Social Security program or access to quality health care, that the opportunity for our young people should be as bright and open for all children, because there's a level of quality that's being provided. And we stop trying to outsource the delivery of public education, that we actually make public education the resource it should be, and that we protect the rights of those who are disadvantaged. That's the opportunity we have today. That's the opportunity that we must seize upon in this moment, where these three intersecting factors are coming together. Peaceful protests in the streets with individuals that look like America. Corporate acknowledgement that structural racism exists, but more importantly, it is now bad for business. And a November election cycle that we must move from the streets to the polling place, and from the polling place, once successful, to hold accountable individuals who was elected because of that value proposition, and enact public policy to address the structural injury that prior public policy has created for far too many people in this country. Thank you once again for this opportunity to come before. I hope my closing remarks is consistent with what was stated early, but I am very clear we will only be successful with all of us, and we will be defeated if we don't stand together in this moment. Thank you very much, and I look forward to next year where we could be together in person.
Thank you, President Johnson. Thank you for leading the charge for us as the next generation of the NAACP, as you know, but also the many civil rights advocates around the country. I first echo Professor Orfield's comments to you earlier that we are honored to have you close out our 2 days of the third annual and first virtual Summit for Civil Rights. Thank you to everyone who joined us over the last 2 days. Thank you to our preeminent panelists, distinguished moderators, and the hardest working Summit Planning Committee, both on screen and behind the scenes. The panels were informative, and we have all been galvanized to act. The summit has been about sharing the torch as we live in these unprecedented times. The summit also inspires us to build multiracial power to fight segregation and build a just society with inclusive opportunity. We run a 4-day training institute that helps us build our individual and collective power to lead this fight. Established and emerging leaders who have participated in previous institutes report that they have been invaluable. Offered Thursday through Sunday, the institutes are unique in both teaching organizing skills and habits and deepening our understanding of racism and economic inequality and how to build multiracial power to fight them. If you want more information, please continue to follow our updates on the summitforcivilrights.org and buildingoneamerica.org. That's building one and O-N-E America.org. And 2 training institutes will be held soon at Cleveland State University and Stockton University. So next I will turn this over to Professor Orfield and next to preacher, teacher, and leader, Reverend Dr. Timothy T. Boddie for final remarks. Professor.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to especially thank Derrick Johnson and Richard Trumka. I wonder if they're still here, if they've left the conference.
No, I'm still here.
Okay, and is Mr. Trumka still here too? Maybe we've lost him. Well, I just wanted to thank you both. Both of you gave powerful, wonderful speeches, and I wish that you could have been here on the same panel. And we'd like to ask if we can work with you and support your efforts and seek your advice as we're thinking about how to move forward on policy issues to support labor and civil rights. We hope you can stay our partner, and we're very grateful for your coming here.
Well, for me, I do whatever Professor John Britton tells me to do, so I'm sure the answer is yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you again for being here, and thank you everyone for being here, for all the powerful speeches, and I'll turn it over. Go ahead. I think Ted is going to do the closing. Is that right? Ted, are you here?
I am. I had been muted and blacked out, so I needed to reverse that. Let me say how wonderful a couple of days this has been. And although we've said it many times now, the fact that this has coincided with our nation's farewell to the great John Lewis, and keeping in mind that we recently lost one of the other great civil rights advocates. Actually, we've lost a couple of them recently. So this is an extraordinary time. And it's an extraordinary time because even as we've been here, we've seen by tweet threats to the election in November. We've seen that this madness that we're in, this war we're in right now, it keeps spinning. COVID-19, the White House, et cetera. But this is a wonderful gathering that we've had. I want to thank, on behalf of those of us who have put this together, the committee that worked to make sure this all happened. The committee names are up there, I think, now, and I'm not going to read them all. I think you all can read through them, but every one of these individuals gave of their time and energy because they're committed to the cause of civil rights, labor rights, justice. And so we want to say thank you for all of that. We also want to thank the sponsors. I think we have the sponsors listed here also. I want to make sure that we're not leaving anybody out, but I think all the sponsors are listed here. Is the International Brotherhood of Teamsters listed on that that slide that was up?
Yep, they made it.
Yes,
Yep.
I see. Okay. And so, again, grateful to all of these individuals, but more than anything else, we're grateful to you, those of you who have tuned in to this this gathering and been patient with us because of the technology glitches. You've been understanding, but we are grateful for your participation. I think we had about 500 people register. That's a significant number. And we thank all of the people who served on panels, who spoke. I want to say a special thank you to Paul Scully. And everybody, I think, knows, even if his face has not been prominent, there he is. Want to thank him for his role in making sure that this happened. And I can't say enough about him. And my co-chair, Yolanda Melville. I want to thank her. I think it's very evident that we've had a lot of I started to say tomorrow's leaders, but they're today's leaders. I'm talking about leaders from a generation that is taking the baton, but also working with some of us old heads who are still out here. And so it's one of the things I feel best about as we've gathered. So we don't know where we're going to be a year from now. We know where we hope we're going to be, and we know, I think, what we have to do to make sure that we get there. But I am assuming that we will all be together again, and we can hope that we'll be together again physically. If not, we'll be together virtually again, but we look forward to being together with you, and we hope the circumstances are that we can advance working with some of the others who were here, Derrick Johnson, and I think Mr. Trumka has left by now, but all of the other people who are here. We hope we can all work together next year and advance our agenda. So once again, thank you. If any of my colleagues, can clean up anything that I've left unattended, now's the time, because if not, we're going to say thank you. And
I'm just going to say Mr. Trumka is still there, smiling and watching you. And
oh,
waiting.
he is. Okay,
Yeah.
I don't see him, but I'll take your word for it. And that's good news. And so let us
Nice,
go
the big
forward.
shots stay through the end,
Yeah.
like you.
All right. Well, so let us go forth and struggle.
Yes. Amen.
All right. With that, be safe. We hope you all stay out of the way of this thing and have a safe commute home. Oh, wait.
Dr. T.
Home.
So Reverend,
Addiction.
Benedict.
We need, that's right. We need to be prayed out. Yolanda, you want to introduce our prayer warrior?
absolutely. And thank you again for allowing me to serve as your co-chair over the last 2 days. I really appreciate the opportunity to work with you, Professor Shaw. So thank you. Without further ado, Reverend Timothy T. Boddie will lead us in our final remarks and pray us out.
Thank you so very much. I want to add my voice to those who have already shared. Thanks for the wonderful, let me go ahead and start this video. I want to add my voice to those of you who have already shared, and what an informative, inspiring, and empowering conference. And even though we have not been together physically, it has been a powerful, powerful, and marvelous experience. I greet you as an independent consultant with one of our partner organizations, Sojourners. I'm the consultant for church engagement with Sojourners. So as we close out, I would ask that each of you virtually hold hands and let us go to God in prayer. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who hast brought us thus far along the way, Thou who hast by Thy might led us into the light, keep us forever on the path, we pray. Keep us forever on the path, we pray, O God of peace. In the name of C.T. Vivian, keep us on the path of peace. In the name of Fannie Lou Hamer, keep us on the path of justice. In the name of Joseph Lowry, keep us on the path of nonviolence. In the name of Shirley Chisholm, keep us on the path of righteousness. In the name of Ella Baker, keep us on the path of freedom. In the name of Martin Luther King Jr., keep us on the path of love. And yes, God, in the name of John Robert Lewis, keep us on the path of good trouble. Good trouble for civil rights, good trouble for workers' rights, good trouble for children's rights, good trouble for women's rights, good trouble for racial rights, and good trouble, yes, for human rights. Lest our feet, O God, stray from the places where we met Thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget Thee. Shadowed beneath Thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God and true to our native land. This is our prayer. In the strong and mighty name of the righteous judge, the one true God, known by many names, I pray this prayer in the name of Jesus, our Lord and Liberator. Let the people of God say in one glad voice, virtually over Zoom, Amen, amen, and amen.
Amen. And thank you, John Britton. Okay, I think, Paul, you have anything before can we disconnect? Are we done? Or
Did they announce the training, right? We're done, yeah.
We did.
We're done.
Visit us
Great
at
job, everybody.
summitforcivilights.org or buildingoneamerica.org. Everyone have a great afternoon.
buildingoneamerica.org or buildingoneamerica.org or summitforcivilrights.org. We'll be in touch with everybody.
That's right.
All right, great.
Safe virtual travels.
Great job, everybody.